Kidnapped girl screamed for help. Bikers spotted the van and surrounded it within minutes. The white van smelled like new plastic and something else, something Emma Carter couldn't name, but her stomach knew before her brain did. 14 years old, in her school uniform, sitting between two adults who called themselves social workers, Emma stared at the woman's badge clipped to her blazer. It looked real. Laminated, official, with a government seal and a photo that actually matched the woman's face. Everything about this looked real. That was the problem. There's just been a small issue with your parents' paperwork, the woman had said outside Emma's school gate 20 minutes ago. Her voice was warm, rehearsed, the kind of warm that comes from practice, not feeling. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. We just need to take you somewhere safe for a night while we sort it out. Emma had believed her. Why wouldn't she? The van had a logo. The man driving had a clipboard. There were even forms, actual forms, printed on official-looking letterhead that Emma had been asked to sign without reading. She'd signed them. Now, watching the city lights fade behind them and the highway stretch out ahead like a long gray ribbon, Emma noticed something that made the hair on her arms rise. They weren't going toward any building she recognized. Not a police station. Not a family services office. Not even in the direction of anywhere Emma had ever been taken before. Where exactly are we going? Emma asked, keeping her voice steady even though her hands weren't. Just a temporary placement, the man said, not turning around. You'll be comfortable. Temporary placement. Emma had heard those exact words before, in a documentary her class watched last year about children in the foster system. Real social workers didn't talk like that. Real social workers explained things. They asked questions. They didn't recite lines. Something was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. Emma pressed her forehead to the window, trying to look calm, trying to think. If she panicked, they'd notice. If she cried, they'd probably just tell her everything was fine, the way adults do when they want you to stop making noise. She needed something else. She needed a plan. That's when she heard it. A low, rolling thunder building somewhere behind the van. Not thunder from the sky. Engines. Dozens of them. She turned and saw them coming up the highway. A wall of motorcycles, chrome catching the afternoon sun, leather jackets patched with the emblem of a charity ride Emma vaguely remembered seeing on the news. Something about raising money for children's hospitals. There had to be 50 riders, maybe more, moving together like a single creature made of noise and steel. For one wild second, Emma almost laughed. Bikers. Of all things, bikers. Then she noticed the small window near the van's back door, a thin strip of glass meant for ventilation, cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of wind. It wasn't much, but it was something. Emma didn't think. She acted. She slid across the seat, ignoring the woman's sharp, "Sit still, please," and shoved her face close to the gap. The wind roared into her ears, but she screamed anyway, screamed with everything she had, waving her hand through the narrow opening so hard her knuckles scraped the metal frame. "Help! Please! Help me!" The woman grabbed for her arm. Emma twisted away, still screaming, still waving, her school tie flapping against her chin. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The bikes roared past in a blur of color and noise, and Emma's stomach dropped. They hadn't seen her. Nobody had. Then one rider, near the back of the pack, turned his head. His name was Daniel Reyes, though Emma wouldn't learn that until later. What he saw in that half-second was simple but impossible to ignore. A small hand jammed through a gap that was never meant to open, and a girl in a school uniform, pale-faced, screaming into the wind of a highway where no child should ever be riding in the back of an unmarked van. Daniel didn't wave back. He didn't hesitate. He gunned his throttle and swerved toward the front of the pack, shouting something Emma couldn't hear over the engines, but that spread through the riders like fire through dry grass. Within moments, motorcycles began peeling off in formation, some sliding ahead of the van, some falling in beside it, some dropping back to block the lane behind. The driver of the van cursed and tried to accelerate. It didn't matter. There was nowhere to go. Metal and rubber surrounded them on every side, tightening like a fist, forcing the van's speed down mile by mile until it had no choice but to pull into a crowded highway service station, tires screeching against the curb. The moment the van stopped, 3 bikers were already off their motorcycles, positioned at each door, arms crossed, expressions unreadable behind dark visors. Inside, Emma sat frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs, not from fear anymore, but from something closer to disbelief. Someone had actually stopped. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Within minutes, two police cruisers screeched into the lot, and officers moved quickly toward the van, hands resting near their belts, voices sharp and commanding. The social workers didn't run. They didn't fight. They simply raised their hands, faces blank, and let themselves be handcuffed without a single word of protest, which, somehow, felt more unsettling than if they'd screamed and struggled the whole way. Emma was pulled gently from the van by an officer who kept repeating, "You're safe now, you're safe," as if saying it enough times could undo the last 20 minutes. But as Emma sat wrapped in a blanket on the back bumper of a police car, watching the two suspects get loaded into separate cruisers, she noticed something odd. Neither of them looked at her. Not with anger. Not with fear of being caught. They looked at each other. One quick, unreadable glance passed between the man and woman just before the doors shut. It almost looked like relief. Emma's parents arrived at the police station so fast that her mother was still wearing one slipper. The reunion was everything Emma had imagined during that terrifying ride on the highway. Her mother's arms crushing the air out of her, her father crouching down to eye level, checking her face and hands like he needed physical proof she was really there. For a few minutes, nothing else mattered. Not the van, not the questions, not the strange calm on the suspects' faces. Just the feeling of being held by people who actually knew her name without reading it off a clipboard. But relief has a short shelf life when something doesn't add up. "We never called anyone," Emma's mother said for the third time, sitting across from Detective Priya Nair in a small interview room that smelled like old coffee. "No paperwork issue. No welfare visit. Nothing." Detective Nair nodded slowly, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of the documents the fake social workers had carried, court authorization forms, agency identification, even a letter with the school's official stamp on it. "That's the problem," Nair said. "These aren't sloppy fakes. Look at the paper stock. The seal. Whoever made these had access to real templates, real fonts, maybe even real government letterhead at some point. This isn't a couple of amateurs grabbing a kid off the street." Emma's father frowned. "So it's organized. A gang." "Possibly," Nair said. "Or something worse. A group that's done this before and knows exactly how to make it look ordinary." Emma, wrapped in a blanket in the corner chair, had been mostly quiet since the police station lights had stopped feeling too bright. But something had been sitting in her chest since the van, something she hadn't said out loud yet, because she wasn't sure it mattered. "There were other kids," she said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "When they picked me up," Emma continued, twisting the edge of the blanket in her fingers, "it wasn't just outside the school. They took me into a little office first, just for a few minutes, they said. To confirm my details, it had a waiting area. And I heard voices. Kids' voices. Through the wall. Laughing, actually. Not scared laughing, just regular laughing. Like they were playing a game or something." Detective Nair leaned forward. "Were any of those children in the van with you?" "No," Emma said. "Just me." The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than before. "That office," Nair said carefully. "Do you remember where it was?" Emma tried to picture it. The beige walls, the posters about healthy eating, a receptionist's desk with a bowl of wrapped candies. It had felt so normal. That was the strangest part. Nothing about it had felt like a trap. "I don't know the street name," Emma admitted. "But I remember a bakery next door. Yellow sign. And there was a parking lot with a broken lamppost." Nair wrote it down without comment, but Emma caught the slight shift in her expression, the look of someone recalculating the size of a problem. Outside the interview room, in the station's waiting area, a small crowd of bikers had gathered, still in their leather vests, helmets tucked under their arms like men who weren't quite ready to leave. Officers had asked them to stay for statements, but most of them lingered longer than necessary, restless in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork. Daniel Reyes stood apart from the others, arms crossed, staring at the closed door of the interview room like it might answer his questions through sheer will. He'd been riding for 12 years. He'd seen accidents, breakdowns, the occasional drunk driver weaving across 3 lanes. He had never seen anything like a child's hand shoved through a 2-inch gap, screaming into 80 miles an hour of wind. and something about the whole thing itched at him in a way that wouldn't sit still. They didn't run, he said, mostly to himself. One of the other riders, an older man named Marcus, glanced over. What? The two in the van. When we boxed them in, they didn't try to escape, didn't argue with the cops. They just surrendered. Like it was expected, Daniel shook his head. People who kidnap kids for money, they panic. They fight. They lie their heads off. These two acted like getting caught was part of the job. Marcus considered that. You think there's more of them? I think, Daniel said slowly, that whoever's really running this didn't lose a thing today. 2 people got arrested, sure. But nobody talked. No names. No location. If this is bigger than 2 people in a van, and I think it is, then today wasn't a rescue. It was a speed bump. Marcus let out a low breath. So what do we do? Leave it to the cops. Daniel looked back at the interview room door, thinking of the girl inside, steady enough to notice details most adults would have missed in a panic. A bakery. A broken lamppost. Kids laughing through a wall. The cops will do their job, Daniel said. But they're bound by rules we're not. We've got time, we've got roads, and we've got eyes in every town between here and the coast, he paused. I say we ask if we can help. Quietly. Legally. Whatever they need. Marcus almost smiled. The club's not going to say no to that. Inside the interview room, unaware of the conversation happening just beyond the door, Emma finally asked the question that had been sitting under her ribs since the highway. Those kids I heard laughing, she said quietly. Are they going to be okay? Detective Nair didn't answer right away, and that silence told Emma everything the woman didn't want to say out loud. The bakery with the yellow sign wasn't hard to find. Detective Nair's team cross-referenced Emma's description with zoning records for the district near her school, and by mid-morning the next day, they had an address. A modest storefront squeezed between the bakery and a shuttered hardware shop, in a strip of small businesses that had seen better decades. A faded sign in the window read Bright Futures Family Support Center in cheerful blue letters, the kind of name that sounded harmless enough to walk past 100 times without a second glance. By the time officers arrived with a warrant, the office was empty. Not abandoned-looking, emptied. There's a difference, and Nair noticed it immediately. The furniture was gone. The filing cabinets were gone. Even the carpet in one corner showed fresh vacuum lines, like someone had cleaned up on their way out the door. Whoever ran this place hadn't panicked and fled after the highway incident. They'd left with purpose, methodically, sometime in the last 12 hours. They knew we'd trace it, Nair said, standing in the center of the empty waiting room. Which means they had a plan for exactly this moment. But methodical people still make mistakes, and this one had left more behind than it probably realized. In the back office, wedged behind a radiator that had apparently been too much trouble to unbolt, officers found a spiral appointment book, its pages slightly warped from the heat. Dozens of entries filled its pages, names, dates, times, all written in a neat, looping hand. Family consultations, educational assessments, emergency housing intake. Daniel and 2 other riders, granted permission to assist as civilian volunteers under police supervision, stood near the doorway examining a bulletin board that hadn't been fully cleared. Pinned to it was a large regional map, dotted with red pushpins scattered across 5 different counties. That's not a random spread, Daniel said, studying the pattern. Look how close together these clusters are. Whoever ran this place wasn't just working here. They were building something bigger. Nair joined him, arms crossed, eyes narrowing at the map. Or scouting. Every pin could be a family they'd already made contact with. In the corner of the waiting room, half hidden under an overturned chair, a young officer found a handful of children's drawings, crayon sons, stick figure families, a house with too many windows. They looked like the kind of thing you'd expect in any pediatrician's office, harmless and sweet. Except this wasn't a pediatrician's office. It was, according to every sign and paper trail, a fake one. Word had already spread through the neighborhood that police were investigating the shop, and within the hour, a small cluster of local parents had gathered outside, nervous and confused. Nair invited them in for questioning, one at a time, and the answers that came back painted a picture more unsettling than any confrontation could have. They were so kind, said one mother, twisting a tissue in her hands. They offered free tutoring for my son. Said the district had a grant program. I never had to pay anything. They helped me fill out housing assistance forms, said another. My husband lost his job in the spring. These people showed up like angels. They talked to my daughter for almost an hour, a third parent admitted, voice shaking slightly now that she was saying it out loud. Called it an educational interview. I was in the next room the whole time. Nothing seemed wrong. Nair listened to each account, jotting notes. But the pattern forming in her mind had nothing to do with what the parents had witnessed and everything to do with what they hadn't. They didn't need to force anyone, she said quietly to Daniel, once the last parent had left. They spent months earning trust. Free programs, real kindness, real help, probably real in some cases. That's what makes this so hard to catch. Nobody suspects the people who are genuinely useful to them. Daniel's jaw tightened. So Emma wasn't the plan. Emma was a mistake. What do you mean? Every other family, they built trust first, Daniel said, working it out as he spoke. Weeks, maybe months of being the nice, helpful people down the street. But Emma's parents never met these two. There was no relationship, no trust built up beforehand. They just grabbed her outside school with fake paperwork. That's a different method entirely. Rushed. Risky. Nair's eyes sharpened. Which means either they were behind schedule on something, or Emma was never supposed to be picked up the normal way, Daniel finished. Somebody made a decision to move fast. And people don't rush unless they're worried about running out of time. Outside, through the shop's dusty front window, Emma sat in her father's car, watching investigators carry evidence boxes to a van. She couldn't hear the conversation happening inside, but she recognized something in the tired set of Detective Nair's shoulders as she stepped out onto the sidewalk. This wasn't over. It wasn't close to over. And somewhere on that pinned map with its 5 red counties, other children, the ones with real appointment slots, real drawings, real trust already given, were still waiting for programs and promises that were never going to come true. The appointment book turned out to be worth more than anyone expected. Detective Nair's team spent 2 days cross-referencing every name, date, and location scrawled inside it. And what emerged wasn't a single operation. It was a web. Schools, churches, youth centers, community halls. The fake agency, or agencies, Nair suspected the name changed depending on the town, had touched dozens of places across the region, always leaving the same impression behind. Polite, generous, professional people who seemed to genuinely want to help. That's what worries me most, Nair told her team during a morning briefing. Every single person we interview says the same thing. Nobody has a bad word to say about them. That doesn't happen with criminals. That happens with people who are very, very good at their job. Since the bikers had proven useful, fast, mobile, and able to cover ground without the bureaucracy that slowed police work, Nair authorized Daniel's small group to continue assisting, visiting locations and gathering informal statements that officers could later follow up on formally. It became, in an odd way, a road trip with a purpose. Daniel, Marcus, and 2 other riders named Sophia and Big Pete crossed 3 cities in 4 days. Motorcycles parked outside school offices and community centers instead of highway diners. At a church in the next county, a youth pastor remembered the family support volunteers fondly, describing how they donated backpacks and school supplies before every semester. At a youth center 2 towns over, a coordinator pulled out a thank you plaque the group had left behind, engraved, professional, clearly not cheap. Whoever's funding this isn't scraping by, Daniel muttered, staring at the plaque. This takes real money, real planning. Emma, against her parents' initial hesitation, had asked to come along for one of the visits. The youth center, specifically, since it was close to home and her mother agreed to stay with her the entire time. Nair allowed it, partly because Emma's memory had already proven sharper than most trained observers, and partly because sometimes the person who lived through something notices what everyone else walks past. It was there, flipping through an old community newsletter pinned to a corkboard, that Emma stopped cold. That folder, she said, pointing. In a grainy photo from a family resource fair, 8 months earlier, a smiling woman stood behind a table, handing pamphlets to a line of parents. Tucked under her arm was a blue folder, glossy, branded with a small logo Emma recognized instantly. That's the same folder, Emma said. The woman in the van had one just like it. Same color, same little logo in the corner. I saw it on the seat next to her. Daniel leaned in close to the photo. The logo was small, almost decorative, a stylized tree with the words "growing together" curved beneath it. Different agency name than the one at the office, Nair said when she reviewed the photo later. But the same folder. Same logo. That's not a coincidence. That's a supplier. It took another day of phone calls, but eventually investigators tracked the folders to a mid-sized printing company 2 counties away. The owner, a tired-looking man named Grant Whitfield, pulled up his order records without much resistance once he understood the seriousness of the visit. "We printed about 600 of those," he said, scrolling through his screen. "Ordered under a business name. Growing Together Family Services, paid in cash, which was unusual, but not illegal. Guy who placed the order was polite. Professional. Gave me a business card and everything." "Do you still have the card?" Nair asked. Whitfield rummaged through a drawer and produced it. Clean, well-designed, the same tree logo stamped in the corner. The address printed beneath it, when Nair looked it up, belonged to a small office suite in a business park nearly 90 miles away. The trail was moving, growing. Every stop revealed another layer, another name, another location the fake organization had touched and then quietly folded away, like a magician packing up one trick before starting the next. That evening, back at the police station, Daniel found himself staring at a corkboard Nair had set up, strings connecting cities, dates, and business names into a spreading constellation. It no longer looked like the work of 2 people in a van. It looked like a business, with departments, funding, and a supply chain. "They've done this before," Daniel said quietly. "More than once. Maybe a lot more than once." Emma, sitting nearby with a cup of hot chocolate she hadn't touched, studied the map with an expression that had aged several years in the last week. "If they've done it before," she said slowly, "then wherever the other kids went. It's not the first time." Nair didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The silence in the room said what none of them wanted to say out loud. That somewhere out there, past every red pin on the map, past every polite volunteer and printed pamphlet, there might already be children who had disappeared this exact same way, quietly enough that no one had ever pieced the pattern together. Until now. The business park address led nowhere useful. Just a rented mailbox service, paid in advance, no cameras, no name that matched anything real. But tucked inside the folder of documents recovered from the printing company was something more valuable than an address. A delivery record. 600 folders, shipped in batches, to a rural property 90 minutes outside the city. Nair pulled up the property records herself. Officially, it was listed as Hollow Pines Learning Retreat, a private countryside estate advertised, according to an old cached webpage, as an educational enrichment program for children needing extra support. "There's no state registration for it," Nair said, frowning at her screen. "No licensing, no oversight. Just a website that hasn't been updated in months and a phone number that goes straight to voicemail." By the following morning, a coordinated team of police, child welfare officials, and, at Nair's quiet insistence, Daniel's group of writers, who had proven useful enough that nobody questioned their presence anymore, made the drive out to Hollow Pines. The property itself nearly stole the investigation's urgency. It looked less like a hideout and more like something out of a brochure. A large stone manor house surrounded by neat gardens, a converted barn that served as a library, even a small pond with a wooden footbridge. Nothing about it looked frightening. That, everyone quickly realized, was exactly the point. Inside, the illusion held just as strong. Bright classrooms with real textbooks. A cafeteria with a posted weekly menu. Bunk rooms decorated with hand-painted murals of forests and stars. If Nair hadn't known better, she might have believed the learning retreat, branding herself. "This isn't thrown together," she murmured, walking the main hallway. "Someone built this to be believed." Staff members, 6 adults who introduced themselves as teachers and caretakers, didn't resist the sudden arrival of authorities. If anything, several seemed confused, even defensive on the program's behalf, insisting they had simply been hired to teach and supervise. 2 of them, once questioned separately, admitted they genuinely hadn't known anything was wrong. They'd answered a job posting, been paid regularly, and had no reason to suspect the children in their care weren't exactly where their families wanted them. That was, perhaps, the most unsettling detail of all. 11 children were found on the property, ranging from Emma's age down to a boy who couldn't have been older than 7. None of them showed signs of neglect. They were fed, clothed, occupied with lessons and games, and, most confusingly for the investigators, largely unafraid. "We're just waiting to go to the next session," one girl, maybe 11 years old, explained to a child welfare officer, swinging her legs from a library chair. "They said it's a special program. My mom signed me up because I needed help with reading." Officer after officer heard some version of the same story. Parents struggling with something, money, housing, a child falling behind in school, had been offered free, generous, seemingly wonderful help. A stay at Hollow Pines. A learning retreat. Promises of return dates that, upon closer inspection, kept quietly shifting further and further away. Daniel stood near the barn library, watching a small boy carefully organize a shelf of picture books, completely unaware that his life had just been pulled out from under a lie. "They're being taken care of," Daniel said quietly to Nair. "That's what gets me. It's like whoever's running this actually believes they're doing something good." Nair's expression was grim. "Or they know that well-cared-for children don't ask questions. Don't try to run. Don't tell strangers something's wrong." It took most of the day to begin the slow, careful process of confirming identities, contacting families, and reuniting children with parents who had no idea their sons and daughters had been living 90 minutes away the entire time. Some parents wept with relief on the phone. Others, confused, insisted their children were supposed to still be at session 2 for another 3 weeks. Emma, who had come along with her father this time, found herself sitting with a girl named Priya, one of the older children at Hollow Pines, in a quiet corner of the garden while the adults worked through paperwork inside. "Were you scared?" Emma asked gently. Priya shook her head. "Not really. They were nice. It just felt like school, but nicer." She hesitated, picking at the hem of her sleeve. "The only weird part was when kids left." Emma sat up a little straighter. "What do you mean, left?" "Every few days, someone new would come, stay a little while, and then get moved," Priya said. "They always said it was because a spot opened up somewhere better. A learning center, they called it. For kids who were doing really well, I guess. Everyone wanted to get picked for it." Emma felt something cold settle in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had watching the highway lights fade behind the van days ago. "Do you know where it is?" she asked. "This learning center." Priya shook her head slowly. "No. Nobody who left ever came back to tell us." The phrase learning center haunted Detective Nair for 2 straight days. Every child interviewed at Hollow Pines mentioned it eventually. Always secondhand, always vague. A place where kids who were doing well got transferred, a reward wrapped in mystery. Nobody could describe where it was. Nobody had ever returned to say. "It's a pattern I've seen before in trafficking-adjacent cases," Nair explained to her team, though she hated saying the words out loud with Emma sometimes in earshot. "Break the chain into steps. Nobody at any single location knows the whole picture. If one place gets caught, the rest keep running." The break came, unexpectedly, from Emma herself. Sitting in the passenger seat of her father's car on the drive home from Hollow Pines, replaying the highway ride in her memory for what felt like the 100th time, Emma suddenly sat upright. "The mural," she said. Her father glanced over. "What mural, sweetheart?" "When they had me in the van, before the bikers came, we drove past a building with this huge painted mural on the side. Like, colors everywhere. Waves, I think, and seagulls. I only saw it for a second, but it was massive. You don't forget something like that." She described it in as much detail as she could to Nair that evening. Blues and yellows, a stretch of ocean, birds mid-flight, painted across what looked like the entire side of a building. It wasn't much. But combined with the fact that the van had been driving toward the coast before the bikers intercepted it, it was enough of a lead to search. 2 days of image searches through public art registries and city murals eventually produced a match. A mural completed 18 months earlier on the side of a building near a coastal bus terminal, roughly 2 hours from where Emma had been taken. The terminal itself was unremarkable, busy with commuters and travelers, easy to disappear into. Nair, Daniel, and a small task force arrived to find that the office space adjacent to the terminal, rented under yet another business name, Coastal Youth Pathways, had closed only days earlier. Landlord records showed the tenant had given notice the same week the van was intercepted on the highway. They're not staying ahead of us by luck, Daniel said grimly, standing outside the shuttered storefront. They're staying ahead of us by watching. Someone in this organization knew about the highway arrest fast. Fast enough to start shutting things down before we even reached the first office. This time, though, the group hadn't cleaned quite as thoroughly. Perhaps the short notice hadn't given them time. In a back storage closet, behind a stack of empty moving boxes, officers found an old laptop, cracked screen, clearly left behind because it no longer powered on properly. It took the department's forensic technician less than a day to pull data from the hard drive. What they found made Nair sit back in her chair and rub her eyes for a long moment before speaking. Spreadsheets. Dozens of them. Appointment logs cross-referenced with bus schedules, rental vehicle records, and what appeared to be internal codes assigned to different programs, Hollow Pines among them, listed simply as Site 4. Other sites were listed too, numbered 1 through 9, spread across the region and, troublingly, into at least one neighboring state. But it was a separate file, buried in a folder labeled Family Outreach, that told the real story. It contained names, hundreds of them, organized not by child, but by family circumstance. Housing insecurity, recent job loss, single parent, limited support network, non-English speaking household. They weren't picking children at random, Nair said quietly, scrolling through the file with Daniel and 2 other officers watching over her shoulder. They were picking families who were struggling, families who'd be grateful for help, families less likely to ask too many questions, or who might not have the resources to push back if something felt wrong. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. And Emma's family didn't fit that pattern at all. No, Nair agreed, which still doesn't explain why they grabbed her the way they did. Rushed, sloppy, compared to everything else here. She tapped the screen. Something changed their plan. Something made them desperate enough to break their own rules. The transportation records offered one more piece of the puzzle, a recurring route, repeated dozens of times over the past year, always beginning at one of the numbered sites and ending at a location simply logged as Central. No address, no name, just Central, referenced so often it clearly meant something significant to whoever had built this system. Emma, who had been allowed to sit in on part of the debrief, given how much of the investigation now traced back to details only she remembered, stared at the word on the screen. Central, she repeated softly. That has to be the learning center. The one Priya talked about. Nair nodded slowly, already reaching for her phone to request warrants for banking records tied to the rental agreements. The only thread left that might reveal where, exactly, Central was hiding. If that's the heart of this whole operation, she said, then that's where every road leads. And that's where we're going to find out exactly how many children have walked through those doors before Emma's van ever hit the highway. Banking records took time, warrants, subpoenas, the slow grinding machinery of the law that Daniel had grown impatient with over the past week. But while forensic accountants worked to trace the money behind Central, Nair made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. I want to bring the families in, she told her team. All of them. Every household connected to Growing Together, Coastal Youth Pathways, Hollow Pines, Bright Futures. Every name on that spreadsheet. Not just to ask them questions. To tell them the truth and let them process it before this becomes a headline they read on their phones. It wasn't standard procedure. It was, as one colleague pointed out, a lot of driving for something a phone call could technically handle. But Nair had seen enough over the past week to know that this case wasn't going to be solved by paperwork alone. It was going to be solved by people trusting each other enough to remember things they hadn't realized mattered. So began what Daniel would later call, half-joking, the world's strangest road trip, a rotating convoy of police vehicles and motorcycles moving between small towns and villages across 3 counties, visiting families one at a time, sitting in kitchens and living rooms to explain, gently, that the kind strangers who had once offered help had not been who they claimed to be. It was, without question, the hardest part of the investigation. Some parents cried. Some grew angry, not at the organization, but at themselves, certain they should have known better, should have asked more questions, should have trusted their instincts when something had felt slightly too perfect. Nair had prepared statements for this. Careful language about manipulation and trust-building being deliberate tools used by people who did this professionally. It rarely eased the guilt entirely. Emma, With her parents' permission and Nair's encouragement, came along for several of these visits, not to investigators' homes, but specifically to speak with children close to her own age who had been part of the outreach programs, some of whom were now anxious, confused, uncertain whether they'd done something wrong. In one small village 2 hours from home, Emma sat across from a boy named Tomas, maybe 12 years old, who hadn't said a single word to any of the adults since police arrived at his family's door that morning. "I got taken in a van too," Emma said simply, sitting on the floor instead of a chair, meeting him at eye level. "Not this same one, but the same kind of people. I was really scared. But you know what? None of this is your fault. Or your parents' fault. These people are really good at tricking grown-ups. That's their whole job." Tomas glanced up for the first time. "You were scared?" "So scared," Emma admitted. "I still get nervous around vans that look official. It's okay to feel weird about it." Something in Tomas's shoulders loosened, just slightly. By the end of the visit, he'd remembered a detail he hadn't thought to mention to police, a name he'd overheard once, spoken quietly between two of the program's coordinators when they thought no children were listening. Mr. Halden. It wasn't much. A single name, no last name confirmed, no face attached. But it was new, and new was valuable. Emma's presence had an effect Nair hadn't fully anticipated. Adults spoke to police out of obligation. Children, especially those who'd spent weeks or months inside these programs, often spoke more freely to someone their own age who had lived through a version of the same fear and come out the other side able to talk about it calmly. Village by village, detail by detail, the picture sharpened. A girl in a neighboring town remembered a delivery van that arrived every second Thursday, always at the same time, always driven by the same man. A mother recalled a donation drive where program coordinators had specifically asked about her financial situation before offering help, a detail she'd dismissed as thoughtful concern at the time, now recognized as calculated screening. By the end of the week, Nair's corkboard back at the station had grown so dense with strings and photographs that it resembled a spider's web spun by someone slightly unwell. But within that tangle, patterns kept surfacing. The name Halden appeared twice more, always secondhand, always just out of reach. One evening, driving back from the last village on their list, Daniel glanced at Emma in the rearview mirror of the car he'd insisted on borrowing instead of riding, given how late it had gotten. "You okay?" he asked. "That's a lot of hard conversations for 1 week." Emma was quiet for a moment, watching the darkening fields pass outside the window. "I keep thinking about what Priya said," she finally answered. "About kids getting sent to the learning center like it was a reward. Like it was something to want." She shook her head slowly. "These families gave them everything. Trust, their kids, their hope that things would get easier. And it was all just bait." Daniel didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. But somewhere in the growing web of names, routes, and half-remembered details, a location was finally beginning to take shape. A place the fragments kept circling back to, again and again, like every road on that map had always been leading toward one final door. The name Halden finally connected to something real on a Tuesday morning, when a forensic accountant traced a shell company's registration paperwork to a man named Richard Halden, not a stranger with a criminal record, but a licensed business consultant who had, on paper, spent the last decade helping nonprofits with operational structuring. "That's almost funny," Nair said, staring at his professional headshot on a consulting firm's website. Clean suit, warm smile, the kind of face that belonged on a brochure. He's not hiding from the system. He built himself right into it. The banking trail, once it connected to Halden's name, moved faster than anything before it. Rental payments across 9 different sites, all routed back through a series of accounts that eventually converged on a single commercial building, a restored historic property in the heart of the city, currently leased to a company called Halden Family Futures Foundation. It was, Nair noted with something between exhaustion and disbelief, hiding in plain sight the entire time. Not a remote countryside manor. Not a shuttered storefront near a bus terminal. A respectable-looking office in a respectable-looking building, 3 floors up from a coffee shop. Nair had personally bought lunch from twice that month without ever glancing at the directory in the lobby. This time, there was no highway chase, no dramatic confrontation. Nair had learned enough from the past week to know that rushing in with sirens blaring risked scattering evidence, and worse, risked the very real possibility that children inside might be moved or hidden before anyone could act. Instead, the operation unfolded with painstaking patience. Surveillance for 2 full days. Confirmation of staff schedules, delivery patterns, and, most importantly, how many children were currently on the premises. Warrants were drafted with careful precision, covering every entity connected to Halden's name. When the raid finally happened, it looked almost anticlimactic from the outside. A handful of unmarked vehicles, a small team of officers moving calmly through the building's front entrance during business hours, badges out, voices low and controlled. Inside, the 3rd floor told a story different from anything they'd found before. No painted murals, no pretend classrooms dressed up to look wholesome. This was simply an office, desks, filing cabinets, a small break room. Professional and unremarkable, except for a locked door at the end of a hallway that led to a converted suite of rooms where 7 children, ranging from 6 to 13 years old, were found. They weren't harmed. They weren't hidden in anything resembling a dungeon or a cage. They'd been told, like every child before them, that they were part of something good, a special program, an exclusive next step for kids who'd done well in their previous sessions. A woman who introduced herself as their teacher had been reading to them from a picture book when officers entered. That woman, along with 3 other staff members present, offered no resistance and, notably, very few answers. When questioned, most claimed limited knowledge of the larger operation, insisting they'd simply been hired for specific roles, teaching, coordinating schedules, managing supply orders, without ever asking who was truly in charge or why the arrangement required such secrecy. Richard Halden himself was not present. His office, the largest on the floor, showed clear signs of a hurried departure. Drawers left open. A computer wiped clean of files just hours before the raid, according to the system logs technicians later recovered. He knew, Daniel said, standing in the doorway of the empty office, looking at the bare desk where a man had apparently built an entire hidden economy around exploiting desperate families. Someone tipped him off. Nair's expression was grim but unsurprised. There's always someone. A landlord who noticed unusual activity and mentioned it to the wrong person. A staff member who got nervous. It doesn't matter right now. What matters is the 7 kids upstairs. While officers began the careful process of confirming identities and contacting families, the bikers, who had been asked to wait outside during the raid itself, were brought in afterward to help with something police weren't equipped to handle alone: comfort. Daniel found himself sitting on the floor of the makeshift classroom beside a boy who couldn't stop asking when his next session would start, gently explaining, in the simplest words he could find, that there wasn't going to be a next session, that he was going home, today, to a family who had never stopped looking for him even when they didn't know where to look. Sophia, one of the other riders, sat with 2 younger children, letting them examine her leather vest patches while a caseworker made phone calls in the next room, the sound of relieved, disbelieving parents' voices drifting faintly through the walls. Emma wasn't present for the raid itself. Her parents had firmly, and reasonably, drawn a line there, but she arrived that evening as reunification calls continued, watching from a respectful distance as families embraced children they'd been told were simply away at school. Detective Nair, exhausted but steady, found Emma near the building's entrance, watching the last of the evening's reunions unfold. It's not completely finished, Nair admitted quietly. Halden's still out there. There may be more sites we haven't found yet. But this, she gestured toward the families inside, toward the quiet, tearful joy filling the hallway. This is what months of work finally looks like. Emma nodded slowly, watching a little girl practically vanish into her mother's arms. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined back on that highway, screaming through a 2-inch gap in a van window. It was better, quieter, real. Richard Halden was found 11 days later, not fleeing across a border or hiding in some remote cabin, but sitting in a rented car outside a bus station 3 states away, waiting for a connection that would never come. A clerk at a nearby motel had recognized his face from a news broadcast and quietly called the tip line Nair's department had set up. He didn't resist arrest. He simply asked, in a voice Nair later described as unsettlingly calm, whether the children were safe. It was, in its own strange way, the twist nobody investigating the case had expected. Halden wasn't the mastermind of some vast criminal empire built purely for profit, as everyone had assumed. Records recovered from his abandoned office revealed something more complicated. A legitimate family assistance program he'd started over a decade earlier, one that had genuinely helped struggling families, before something in the operation quietly curdled. Somewhere along the way, helping families in need had twisted into controlling which families received help, and on what terms. A slow corruption of good intentions into something that used real generosity as camouflage for something far darker underneath. It didn't excuse what he'd built. It simply explained, in an uncomfortable way, how something so convincing had fooled so many people for so long. In total, investigators confirmed 31 children had passed through the network's various sites over the preceding 2 years. Every single one was eventually identified and reunited with family. No child had been physically harmed, a fact Nair repeated often in press briefings, aware of how much fear had built around the case, and determined not to let rumor outpace reality. The harm, she explained carefully to reporters, had been quieter than that. Months of separation, of families lied to, of children taught to believe abandonment was actually opportunity. The story broke nationally within days, and Emma's name, along with the bikers who'd first surrounded that van on the highway, became impossible to avoid in local news coverage. Reporters wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted appearances. Emma, with her parents' careful guidance, agreed to exactly one thing: a community event, organized 2 weeks after Halden's arrest, bringing together every family the investigation had touched. It was held in a public park on a warm Saturday afternoon, tables set up beneath string lights, children running between adults who, weeks earlier, had been strangers connected only by tragedy narrowly avoided. Motorcycles lined the far end of the parking lot, polished and gleaming, their riders moving comfortably through the crowd in a way that felt less like guests of honor and more like family who'd simply always been there. Emma stood at a small podium that afternoon, note cards trembling slightly in her hands, looking out at faces she recognized from a dozen different kitchens and living rooms across 3 counties: Tomas, Priya, dozens of others whose names she'd learned over weeks of hard, necessary conversations. "A few weeks ago," she began, "I was really scared. I thought being brave meant not being scared at all. But I learned that's not true. Being brave means doing something anyway, even when you're shaking." She glanced toward Daniel, standing near the back with the rest of the riders, arms crossed, trying and failing to look like this wasn't affecting him. "I'm only here because a stranger on a motorcycle happened to look over at exactly the right second. That's it. One person paying attention. That's all it took to change everything." Daniel, when it was his turn to speak, kept it shorter, gruffer, clearly less comfortable behind a microphone than behind handlebars. "We ride every year for kids' hospitals," he said. "Never thought we'd ride into something like this. But I'll tell you what I told my club that day. You don't get many chances in life to actually stop something bad from happening. Most of the time, you just hear about it after. This time, we didn't have to." In the weeks that followed, real changes took root. The state introduced stricter identity verification requirements for anyone claiming to represent child welfare services, along with a public awareness campaign teaching families exactly what questions to ask, what red flags to watch for, and how to verify credentials before trusting a stranger with their children. Halden's foundation, along with every shell organization connected to it, was formally dissolved, its assets redirected toward genuine family support programs, the very thing it had once pretended to be. The biker club, for their part, didn't stop riding. Their annual charity event grew the following year, now officially partnered with 2 verified family assistance organizations, every dollar raised traceable, every program vetted. Daniel liked to joke that they'd accidentally become the most heavily background-checked motorcycle club in the state, though nobody in the club seemed to mind the extra paperwork anymore. Emma still gets nervous sometimes around white vans, a small, quiet reminder of a day that started as an ordinary walk home from school. But she's learned to notice something else now too, the sound of engines in the distance, steady and familiar, the reminder that somewhere out there, strangers are still paying attention. And sometimes, that's all it takes to save a family.